List is an absolute good.
It was a box office hit.
I was the only one that wanted to shoot the picture in black and white. No, the studio didn't.
A powerful film about the Holocaust that for so many was so much more than a movie.
They say that no one dies here. They say your factory is a haven.
It inspired survivors to share their stories,
They stripped him from everything.
educating the world.
It wouldn't have happened without Schindler's List. The Shoah Foundation wouldn't have existed.
Now the Academy Award-winning film is coming back to the big screen.
I think this is maybe the most important time to re-release this for.
Our sit-down with Steven Spielberg 25 years after his groundbreaking movie, Schindler's List.
That is Lester Holt with Steven Spielberg. Filmed a couple of years ago when they did that 25 years since Schindler's List hit the theaters, and how that film just kind of changed perception and really just everything, I think. For me, I remember just coming out of college when it came out, and I was just blown away. So, thought it might be a little more appropriate to start off class with that instead of, the Seinfeld Schindler's List.
Wait, have you seen Schindler's List?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, you have to go. You have to.
I'm going.
You have to.
Okay.
Right, but that entire interview with Lester Holt is on your Google Classroom. Feel free to watch it. It's fantastic. I wouldn't lie to you about that. All right, so as I said yesterday, we're going to jump right back into our A&E biography on Oskar Schindler. All right, and we'll have one quick little breakout session, and then we'll watch the remaining parts together, and then you'll have a final essay question, I guess you could say, extended response, probably a couple of paragraphs, and then that's it, and then you'll be done for the day. So, all right, here we go, Google Live. We're going to jump into our meet and watch, we're just going to call it video number 5. Yikes. All right, quick change of plan, guys. Looking at my little timetable here, don't think we're going to have time for the breakout sessions today, but that's okay. So we're going to jump right into part 5 here in a second. This was part of, this is the full interview of what we started off today's class with. And this is your question today. There are 2 big prompts, hence 20 points that I'm looking for here. And it reads, according to the A&E biography, Oskar Schindler heroically defied the Nazi government to save Jewish lives during World War II. Based on the evidence presented in the biography, how did Schindler position himself to accomplish this act of heroism, if in fact you think it was an act of heroism? And then the author of the book describes Oskar Schindler as a particular blend of contradictions. That is a super important quote. So what did he mean by that statement? And then you're going to respond to all of those prompts in a complete paragraph. All right, so this is actually due today, and so here we go.
In 1943, the Nazi regime's lethal assault on the Jewish people was in full force. At the Plaszow slave labor camp, Commandant Amon Geth gave free rein to his murderous impulses. And yet, despite this brutal environment, Oskar Schindler spent many festive evenings in Geth's villa overlooking the camp.
Oskar was able to drink with the devil, to make deals with the devil. And that's because there was a lot of the devil in him as well. If Oskar hadn't been that particular blend of satyr and black marketeer and drunk and savior, he couldn't have saved them. He had to be that particular blend of contradictions to be a savior in a world where all values were upside down.
To Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, a Jewish maid at Geth's villa, Schindler's close relationship with Geth and his concern for Jews was confusing.
Oskar Schindler came down into the kitchen and he took me to the window. He says, "You see the people down the hill They carried stone, they were digging the hill. He said, look at them, watch them. You see people in Egypt, you Jewish people, when they were enslaved, and then they were freed from Egypt. This is what's going to happen to you. You will see. You're going to be free from that hell.
Schindler soon began to make good on his promise by taking advantage of his close relationship with Goethe and other high-ranking Nazis. Schindler received permission to build a barracks camp next to Amalia. He'd convinced them that his Jews would work harder and longer if they didn't have to commute from Plaszow. The workers themselves benefited as well. They were now out of Goethe's deadly jurisdiction.
Those people really were saved from beating, hanging, killing that was taking place in Camp Plaszow.
Amalia was now a self-contained concentration camp. That made Oskar Schindler the director of a concentration camp. Nonetheless, he provided extra food, medical care, and other necessities that were unheard of in other camps. These special services were expensive, but Schindler could afford them. He was making a fortune on the black market, selling surplus items from his factory. Under German law, Schindler's black market activities were illegal, but so was his humane and cordial treatment of his Jewish workers.
On one occasion, he had his birthday party, and some of the inmates baked a cake, and a little girl, a young girl, took it up to the office and gave it to him. So he gave her a kiss. And this, of course, was a major crime during that period of time.
Schindler was subsequently arrested. It was one of 3 separate arrests, but he was able to talk and bribe his way out of all of them. He was playing a dangerous game.
This is a big operation. He does it openly. He, as a German citizen, is violating their laws openly. He does it at great personal risk and great personal expense, and finally, with no expectation of reward.
In the spring of 1944, Schindler and his Jews had to adapt to changes in the war. The Russians had been steadily advancing on the Eastern Front, and the Germans were retreating. The Nazis ordered all camps and subcamps in Plaszow and Krakow be emptied of their workers. Schindler could have easily walked away a wealthy man at that point, but he knew what would happen to his Jews if he did. Instead, Schindler went to Berlin, where he received authorization to move his Jewish factory workers to a new location in Brinlitz, a town nearby his boyhood home of Svitau. He convinced the Nazis that his new factory would manufacture ammunition by getting his activities and Jews reclassified as essential to the war effort. He hoped to spare his workers from the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Everyone who would go to Brinlitz with Oskar Schindler had to get on his list, a list that meant life. The Jews called it simply Schindler's List. Some 1,100 workers were lucky enough to get their names on it. They were Jews from Schindler's Amalia factory, as well as the Plaszow labor camp. Schindler was even able to make good on his promise to Goethe's maid.
He said, give me the names of your sisters. And that's how my sisters came along with me. The names were put on the list. I really didn't know about the list.
The Jews on Schindler's List didn't go directly to Brinlitz. There were 2 frightening detours. At first, the 801 men were routed to the Gross-Rosen death camp. 300 women were sent to Auschwitz. When they saw the smoke billowing out of its chimneys, they understood the camp's deadly purpose.
They put us in the shower room and are standing there quite some time till we know what is going to come down, or it's going to come down water, or it's going to come down gas. Are we going to get killed? Are we going to get gassed? We didn't know. That was the most horrible minutes, I don't know how long it was. For me, it was very, very long, but it probably wasn't long. But every minute was a year. Und then came water. It came water.
Schindler knew all too well he had to get his Jews out of Gross-Rosen and Auschwitz. 2 of the women had already died there. In this rare interview clip, Schindler explains how he saved his Jews from a fate that so many others had met.
Da habe ich ungefähr 4 Wochen gekämpft. Die waren inzwischen mit anderen nach Auschwitz transportiert.
It was a struggle to get the women out of Auschwitz. It was a miracle that I had them released after 4 weeks, with a list of names. Naturally, it required interventions, telegrams, and journeys to Berlin and Auschwitz.
Es würde zu weit führen, wenn man die Details, diesen Kampf.
We arrived, the men from Gross-Rosen arrived in beginning of November. By the end of November of 1944, he brought the women from Auschwitz, the 298. And he said to, I remember like this was yesterday, thank God you are with me. Hot soup is waiting for you.
In the months to come, Oskar Schindler's increasing humanitarian efforts on behalf of his Jewish workers would far eclipse any endeavors toward personal gain. By January 1945, the war was going badly for the Nazis, and defeat was imminent. Adolf Hitler was nonetheless determined to complete his self-proclaimed mission to resolve the Jewish question. The Nazis had nearly succeeded in exterminating all of Europe's 8 million Jews. Oskar Schindler was at cross purposes with the Nazi regime. He had brought some 1,100 Jews to his war essential factory in Brinlitz, Czechoslovakia. Schindler had now been joined by his wife Emily, who'd come from their nearby hometown, Zwickau. Emily was as horrified as Oskar of the Nazi atrocities.
When Emily joined her husband full-time at the factory in Brinlitz, Czechoslovakia, she was an integral part of the operation and helping people survive.
While Emily's motives for feeding, supplying, and looking after the Jewish workers at this time were primarily humanitarian, Oskar's reasons were still ambiguous.
If your workers are working for you and they are profitable, it is in your economic self-interest to keep them near you and to keep them in conditions that are less grievous so that they're more able to function.
Although Schindler may have begun his wartime endeavors in 1939 as a profit-minded businessman, an incident in January 1945 indicated that at this point in his life, his humanitarian concerns far outweighed his financial motives. 2 cattle cars carrying 132 Jews were on a hellish odyssey that began at a Nazi stone quarry in Goleshaw, Poland. The prisoners had been turned away by several death camps. Ironically, they were too full and too busy killing people to take them in. After 10 days without food, water, or blankets, the frozen prisoners were abandoned at Brinlitz. Oskar Schindler came to their rescue.
So we have to cut out with the welding equipment the doors to remove them. And unbelievable things what we saw. We saw people's dead, 16 of them. There were 132 people in the 2 cattle train.
These people were looked after by Oskar and Emily, and the fact that those carriages, those trucks were opened, the fact that these people were brought onto the floor of Brinlitz, and the fact that their lives were saved, the fact that Oskar bought a plot from the local parish priest for the burial of those who died, all this is an eloquent statement to the honor and benevolence of the Schindlers.
As the cattle car survivors were all in poor health, not one of them worked a single day at Brinlitz. And yet for the next 5 months, Schindler paid the Nazis over 600 marks a day for the 116 Jews he'd taken in. This act alone spoke volumes about the man Schindler had become. On the eve of May 8th, 1945, Oskar Schindler had important information that the Jews in his care had waited 5 years to hear.
Schindler asked us all to gather around. He stood up on something high, and he told us that we were free, the war is over, the Germans have surrendered, and that he was going to leave, and these guards who were standing around behind him were going to leave as well, and he wished us well.
Everyone there was either in tears or in laughs or trying to crawl toward Schindler to kiss him and thank him personally, which was impossible to do with 1,000 people. It was an emotionally charged gathering where we just were short of being able to express our feelings, the unbelievable achievements that we have survived the war, and it was Oskar Schindler that brought us to this point.
The 1,200 or 1,300 Jews Schindler had saved would soon learn of the extent of the Nazi Holocaust. 6 million other Jews had not had an Oskar Schindler to come to their aid, and they had perished. From that moment on, it was Schindler's Jews who would spring to action on his behalf whenever necessary.
We, the survivors, the people who Oskar Schindler fed and protected for 4.5 years, knew when the Russian will take camp of ours, he as a German, as a Nazi, as a profiteer, as a manager of the concentration camp factory, he will not have a chance to survive.
Schindler, the former Nazi war profiteer, was now disguised as a concentration camp survivor. 8 of the Jews he'd rescued spirited him away to Allied forces in the West, where he was able to surrender without repercussion. Oskar and Emily traveled to Munich and pondered the future. He was 37 years old and faced the turbulence of the post-war world. Germany's economy was a shambles. So were Oskar's finances. Despite the millions he'd made during the war, he'd walked away a pauper. Schindler was undeniably a hero, but outside of the survivors who owed him their lives, no one knew or cared.
After the war, when the drama was gone, he was adrift. He was afloat from one business venture to another and basically was a sybarite who lived to have a good time.
Schindler soon acquired enough money to start a new life. In 1949, a Jewish organization awarded him $15,000. It was the first of many financial gifts bestowed upon him by a grateful Jewish community. That year, Schindler moved to Buenos Aires, Argentina, where he, Emily, 2 mistresses, and 3 families he'd rescued attempted to rebuild their lives. Oskar Schindler's post-war life, like everything that had preceded it, was a study in contrast and ambiguity. There were times of great joy and extended periods of despair. While all of his business attempts in Argentina were failing, he always managed to find the time and the money for beautiful women. These activities came to an end in 1957, when Schindler was bankrupt. The following year, he left his wife Emily to fend for herself and returned to Germany, never to see her again. In Frankfurt, Schindler lived in a 1-room apartment overlooking the train station. Whenever he received money from various Jewish organizations, he would leave the squalor of his apartment and live the high life for a while. In 1961, after a number of failed business ventures in Germany, Schindler went to Israel at the invitation of a group of Jews who were among those he'd saved. 800 people greeted him at the airport. At the time, Adolf Eichmann, the architect of Hitler's final solution, was being tried in Jerusalem. The Israeli press learned of Schindler's wartime heroics and played up the obvious contrasts between these two former Nazis. The German press also filed stories about Schindler. So when he returned to Germany, his fellow countrymen knew all about what he'd done during the war.
He was condemned by the Germans, a traitor. He saved witnesses to the truth. 1,300 of them, children, women, and men. And they are alive, and they will talk, and they will tell the truth.
While the Nuremberg trials had held accountable many of the Nazi leaders, like Hermann Goering and even Amon Geth, who were both executed, there were millions of former Nazis who'd escaped punishment and returned to civilian life. Schindler's fellow countrymen called him a Jew kisser. They threw rocks at him. No one would do any business with him. There was even an attempt on his life. Schindler contemplated suicide, but didn't want to give his enemies the satisfaction. Schindler's spirits were lifted when he returned to Israel on April 28, 1962, his 54th birthday. He'd been invited to plant a carob tree in the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial to the Holocaust. Schindler was also awarded a medal. It was inscribed with the Talmudic verse he'd heard 2 decades earlier from Itzhak Stern: "He who saves a single life saves the world entire." In 1963, an article on Schindler's heroism brought his story to the attention of MGM Studios, which optioned it for $50,000. As he did whenever he got money, Oskar spent it quickly. The MGM film was never made. Oskar Schindler's former factory workers eventually began calling themselves Schindler-Juden, Schindler's Jews. They felt a lifelong bond to the man who rescued them. In 1968, survivor Leopold Page and others established a foundation that would provide for Schindler for the rest of his life. Schindler Jude Leon Layson was at a Los Angeles reception held in Schindler's honor. He recalls his emotional reunion with the man who'd saved him, his parents, and 2 of his 4 siblings over 2 decades earlier.
I reached out my hand and started to introduce myself because I realized, I was a grown man, and last time he saw me, I was not yet 15, So he interrupted me. He says, "I know who you are. You're little Layson."
Schindler had many heartfelt reunions with those he'd saved. For the rest of his life, he returned annually to Israel to celebrate his birthday on month-long visits paid for by his Schindler-Juden. They were wonderful times that by all accounts seemed to be the highlights of his post-war life.
He felt in Israel every time he was invited like a king. He was accepted like the most important person, and he was cherished by those people, loved by the new children, by the new generation.
In 1973, Schindler told Page he wanted to be buried in Israel. The following year, on October 9, 1974, Oskar Schindler died of a massive heart attack in Frankfurt. He was only 66. The devastating news traveled quickly to Schindler-Juden throughout the world.
We cry. It was a tragedy for us personally. And I sometimes was asking myself, Did we did enough for him? That we fulfilled the obligation? Maybe yes, maybe no. I try my best.
The Schindler-Juden collected the money to have his remains brought to Israel. At the dedication of his Israeli gravesite, 500 survivors paid last respects to their hero and savior. But Oskar Schindler lives on.
People have a choice in their lives. And Schindler is an example of it. He was a Nazi, but he was a good person.
His story teaches children everywhere they can choose not to grow up hating those who are a different religion, nationality, or race. They can look to Oskar Schindler as a noble example of doing right and opposing those who do wrong.
He's an indictment of the generation of perpetrators. He belies the truth that they think they tell when they say, well, everybody did it, we had no choice, we couldn't have done otherwise, there were no alternatives. You point to Oskar Schindler, there were. He made a difference, and he made a difference when it counted.
All right, that concludes our Google Meet for today. Feel free to log off and go ahead and get started on that exit slip question. Notice once again, it is 20 points, not 10 points. There's 2 huge bullet points there that I'm looking for. Make sure to answer the prompt in full. I will see you guys tomorrow. You can go ahead and log off. I'll see you then.